The canyon had swallowed sound, the way a grave swallows prayer, and the only thing that moved in its shadowed throat was the slow, stubborn breath of the wounded Apache woman, pinned beneath a slab of fallen limestone, her dark hair matted with blood and dust, her leg trapped at an angle that turned pain into a living thing. And when she heard boots scrape above, she didn't cry out because pride had already burned that weakness out of her. So instead she lifted her chin and said in a voice scraped raw by thirst and courage, "Make it quick, cowboy. I won't scream," believing with a calm born of exhaustion that mercy would come in the shape of a bullet. But the man who knelt at the edge of the drop was no executioner and no savior either. Just a rancher whose life had been carved by drought and loss, whose hands knew rope burns and splinters and the weight of responsibility. And when he looked down and saw not an enemy but a human being, clinging to the last threads of breath, something old and unbreakable shifted in him, and he answered quietly that he wasn't there to kill her, that if she trusted him even a little, he would try to lift the stone or find a way to slide her free before the sun finished what the fall had started, and she laughed then, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the canyon walls, because trust was a luxury she had buried with too many names. Yet when he lowered himself down with careful steps, testing each foothold, she watched him with the sharp eyes of a hunter who knows hope can be a trap, noting the tremor in his arms as he braced the rock with a lever fashioned from driftwood, the way sweat traced pale lines through the dust on his face, and as minutes stretched into an hour, the canyon became a crucible where past and present burned together. Her mind drifting to the morning she had ridden out with her people, to the laughter before the ambush, to the way the earth had opened beneath her horse, and his thoughts pulled him back to the ranch he'd built from nothing, to the graves of his wife and child on a hill that caught the evening light. And still he worked, grunting with effort, coaxing the slab, inch by inch, until the pressure eased, enough for blood to return to her, leg in a firestorm of pain that made her teeth chatter, and she bit back a scream because she had promised herself she would not give the canyon that satisfaction. And when at last the stone shifted enough for him to wedge it safely, she slumped against the wall, breath coming in shuddering pulls, and he bound her wounds with strips torn from his own shirt, speaking softly, not to soothe her but to anchor himself, telling her there was water up top and a horse trained to stand steady, that if she could endure a little longer, they might both see another sunrise. And she studied his face then, really looked at him, and saw the truth etched in the lines around his eyes, saw that he was as broken as the land yet still standing, and something in her chest loosened, not trust exactly but a truce with fate, and she let him splint her leg and fashion a sling, the ascent slow and punishing, every movement a negotiation with gravity and pain, until at last the rim of the canyon spilled, light over them, and the world widened again, and he eased her onto the horse, careful as if she were made of glass, and rode with her through heat and silence, toward his ranch because it was the only shelter within reach. And there, in a small cabin that smelled of cedar and smoke, he tended her fever, through the night, cooling her skin, whispering stories of rainstorms and open fields. And when she woke days later with the fever broken, she found him asleep in a chair, head bowed, and she realized that survival was sometimes a shared burden, not a solitary victory. And as weeks passed, her strength returned in uneven steps, the canyon becoming a memory that lived in scars and dreams. And they spoke little at first, two people circling the edges of grief and history. But work has a way of building bridges where words fail, and she learned the rhythms of the ranch while he learned the quiet strength of her people. And when the day came that she could ride again, she stood at the edge of the land and looked back at the man who had refused to make it quick, who had chosen the long, hard road instead. And she told him that the canyon had tried to take her voice, but he had given it back. And he answered that saving her had reminded him why he had kept breathing when he had no reason left. And in that exchange there was no romance written by lightning or fate, only respect forged by endurance. And when she finally rode home to her people, with supplies and a story that would be told and retold, she carried with her the knowledge that mercy could grow even in the most unforgiving places. And he watched her go, knowing the canyon would always echo with her words, not as a plea for death, but as a testament to the moment when two lives met at the edge and chose to pull each other back. After she rode away, the land did not immediately return to silence, because absence can be louder than presence, and the rancher felt it in the way the wind worried the fence wire and the way the horse stamped at night, as if listening for a familiar footfall. And days passed where he half expected to see her shape against the dawn, walking with that careful strength she had learned after the canyon. But instead there was only work and memory, and he buried himself in both because idle hands made room for ghosts. Yet news travels faster than storms in the desert, and within weeks riders began appearing at the edge of his property. Not hostile, not friendly either. Men and women from her, people who came to see the place, where the woman who should have died had been carried back from the earth, and they watched him with eyes sharpened by history, measuring the truth of him by the steadiness of his gaze and the way he offered water without being asked. And he did not explain himself, because explanations are often excuses in disguise. He simply worked alongside them when fences needed mending or a calf went missing. And slowly suspicion thinned into something like acknowledgement. And when she returned at last, it was not as a patient but as a messenger, riding upright despite the limp that would never fully leave her, bringing word that the elders wished to speak with him, not to reward or punish but to understand. And he went because understanding had once saved a life, and he trusted it might again. And the meeting was held under a sky so wide it felt like a witness. Stories traded not as weapons but as offerings, her voice steady as she told of the canyon and the stone and the choice he had made to stay. And when the oldest among them asked why he had risked himself for someone the world had taught him to fear, he answered simply that he was tired of burying what he loved, and the truth of that settled like dust. Not dramatic, but impossible to deny. And from that day the boundary between ranch and reservation softened into a line, crossed by necessity and respect, and she became a bridge, whether she wanted to or not, moving between worlds with the patience of someone who knew how easily the ground could give way, and seasons turned, the land greening briefly before surrendering again to heat. And one afternoon, a storm broke with a violence that echoed the canyon, rain turning arroyos into rivers, and a child was swept away near the old trails. And without hesitation, he rode out with her and others, the search a desperate braid of shouts and thunder, until they found the boy clinging to a mesquite, alive but shaking. And as they carried him back through the downpour, something unspoken locked into place between them. A recognition that survival was not a debt owed once, but a practice renewed. And later, when the fire burned low and the child slept, she sat with him and admitted that sometimes she still heard the canyon calling, that in dreams the stone pressed down and the world narrowed. And he told her that some nights he woke reaching for names that would never answer. And in that shared confession there was no promise, no binding of futures, only the quiet relief of being known. And time did what it always does, sanding sharp edges. And the ranch grew busier, the trails safer, the stories less about blood and more about work done together. And when a railroad crew came with talk of cutting through sacred ground, it was she who stood between anger and violence, who carried warnings and compromises. And it was he who refused to sell, who argued that some things were worth more than money, because once gone, they never came back, and the canyon remained, scarred and indifferent. But now, when travelers passed, they heard two stories instead of one, the old tale of death and the newer one of a choice made at the edge. And sometimes, when the light hit just right, she would ride with him to the rim and stand looking down, not in fear but in remembrance. And she would say that the earth had tested her, and she had stayed. And he would answer that mercy was a muscle that grew stronger the more it was used, and the wind would carry their words away, not to erase them but to scatter them into the wide listening land.